Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Lewis, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. I'd like to welcome you to the Dole Institute of Politics this evening, and thank you for attending tonight's presentation. Before we begin, I'd like you to please turn off your cell phones. After the discussion, we'll open up for question and answer. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper will with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one question. Do not filibuster. And remember our mission of civility and bipartisan discussion here at the Dole Institute. And now I'd like to introduce you to the Associate Director of the Dole Institute, Mrs. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Karen, and good evening. We certainly thank you for joining us this evening for our program, Should the President Be Elected by Popular Vote? But we especially would like to thank you because it is a rainy night. We have needed rain in Kansas, but we thought, let it come after 10 o'clock. So we thank you so very much for being here with us. I would just want to draw your attention to our programs on the back. And just as a reminder, our annual Veterans Gala to honor our veterans is Sunday, November the 13th, and today was the day to RSVP, but we'll take a few more this week if you would like to come or you know somebody who would like to come so we can honor our veterans for their dedication to the United States and certainly for helping us all enjoy democracy. Also, the U.S. Senate From Deliberation to Dysfunction is a 3 p.m. program, and it's a program that will feature Burdett Loomis, who will discuss the scholarly textbook he edited by coordinating the research of noted scholars. And then What to Ask the Person in the Mirror. I love that title. And that's with Rob Kaplan, our Harvard Business School, former vice chairman of Goldman Sachs Group. And then we will end with The Fall of the Soviet Union 20 years later, the future of the post-Soviet region on November the 28th. For our program this evening, it really is our pleasure to present Dr. Koza and Tara Ross. Dr. Koza is the lead author of the book, Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by national popular vote, and he was the originator of the national popular vote legislation. He received his PhD in computer science from the University of Michigan. Koza published a board game involving electoral college strategy in 1966, and from 73 through 87, he was co-founder, the chairman, and CEO of Scientific Games, where he co-invented the rub-off instant lottery ticket used by state lotteries. I'm familiar with those. In the 1980s, he and attorney Barry Fedden were active in promoting adoption of lotteries by various states through the citizen initiative process and state legislative action. And between 88 and 2003, he taught a course on genetic algorithms and genetic programming at Stanford University, where he was a consultant professor. But Tara Ross is the author of Enlightened Democracy, The Case for the Electoral College, and a co-author of Under God, George Washington, and The Question of Church and State. As a lawyer and writer, Tara focuses on the intersection among law, public policy, and constitutional history. She has appeared as a guest on a variety of talk shows, and her work has been published in several law reviews and newspapers, including National Law Review, USA Today, the American Enterprise, Fox News, Human Events, and she's currently a contributing writer to the DallasBlog.com. She's a former editor-in-chief of the Texas Review of Law and Politics and a former associate of Fulbright and Jaworski. She obtained her BA from Rice University and her JD from the University of Texas School of Law. Before I turn the program over to our director, Bill Lacey, I would just like to ask you a few questions to keep in mind, and I'm sure Bill Lacey has additional questions. Why should we keep the Electoral College? Can a candidate win the popular vote and still lose the election? Do all states benefit from the Electoral College? And does my vote really count? I thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I turn this program over to the director of the Dole Institute of Politics, Bill Lacey.
Please welcome our guests tonight. And Dr. Ballard, I didn't realize you played the lotto and were that familiar with it. So.
I just do the scratch-off part.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for coming out. I want to echo what Barbara said on this really rainy evening. Thank you all for coming out and supporting our program. Let's start with a little bit of background on each of our guests. John, how did you go from being a computer scientist to an advocate of the national popular vote?
Well, when I was a graduate student in the 60s in computer science, I was interested in politics, and the Electoral College was very much in the public's attention at the time, in part because of the 1960 election, but more importantly, the George Wallace phenomena, where he was threatening and ultimately did run for president and won a substantial number of electoral votes, which he hoped was going to give him the power to negotiate between the major parties and select the president. And at the same time, in Delaware, the then Republican Attorney General, Buxton, was pursuing a case in the United States Supreme Court, arguing that Delaware and other small states, and incidentally Kansas was one of the states that joined Delaware in this lawsuit, were effectively disenfranchised by our current system of electing the president because of New York's winner-take-all rule, which awards all of New York's electoral votes to the candidate who gets the most votes in New York. And Buxton was arguing that the small states, despite what you may have heard from your high school civics teacher, far from getting an advantage in the Electoral College, are the most severely disadvantaged group because they're all one-party states and they're ignored by presidential candidates. So that lawsuit was the basis for a board game, very complicated, commercially unsuccessful, that we published in 1966 and 68 about how to manipulate battleground states to win the White House without basically having a lot of support.
Okay. Tara, how did you go from studying law at the University of Texas to writing books about the Electoral College and George Washington?
I broke my arm. This is a true story. I broke my arm in January of 2001, so it was right after the 2000 election. I was a very busy law student. I think I needed 6 classes to graduate. I was dating this guy in Dallas that I'm married to now, and it was long distance, and I was trying to be editor-in-chief of a law journal, and now I can't take notes in class. And so I dealt with that in part by doing an independent study on the Electoral College. And I mostly just thought, look, it'll be easy. There's all this information. I'll hardly have to do any research, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wrote a student paper. Fast forward a few years, and I'm writing a law review article, and then I'm quitting my law job, and I'm becoming a full-time writer, and I get an offer to turn this law review article into a book. And I thought, well, I'm a writer. I have a book offer. I guess I better do it. How hard can it be? They gave me 4 months to do it. And it was, my husband ate absolutely nothing except like pizza and stuff for 4 months, and I did it. And what I would just say about that is I didn't set out to become a defender of the Electoral College. I fell into it by a series of random things that happened to me. But now what I've discovered is that the Electoral College is one of the most underappreciated institutions in our Constitution. It is not well understood, and I think my experience is that the better you understand it, like myself, the better you understand it, the more likely you are to support it.
Okay, John, I'm going to ask you to explain your proposal. It's unique in that your view is that it doesn't require a constitutional amendment to implement. So take a little bit of time to explain exactly how it's going to work to everyone.
Well, our proposal is a piece of state legislation which we've introduced into all 50 state legislatures. And it basically says that the presidential candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states will become president. And what's called the National Popular Vote Bill. It's law already in 9 states, and those states have 132 electoral votes. Now, the reason we're at the state legislative level is that the U.S. Constitution gives the state legislatures exclusive power to award electoral votes. It says each state shall appoint in such manner as the state legislature thereof shall direct a number of electors. And beyond that, the Constitution places no restriction on how the states decide to award their electoral votes. So under the National Popular Vote Bill, a state such as Vermont, which enacted the bill just recently, says Vermont will give its 3 electoral votes to the presidential candidate who gets the most popular votes in all 50 states. However, we're not doing this unilaterally. This will only take effect in Vermont when other states, together having a majority of the electoral votes, which is 270 out of 538, pass the very same law. So with the 9 states we have, we're a little less than halfway to the group of states, probably about 2 dozen, that it would take to reach 270 electoral votes and to bring these laws into effect simultaneously for some future presidential election, probably 2016. So the rationale for this is that there's major shortcomings with the current system of electing the president. And all of those shortcomings go back to one thing, the so-called winner-take-all state laws. So you have a law in Kansas that says whoever gets a bare plurality of the popular votes in Kansas will get 100% of Kansas' 6 electoral votes. That's the winner-take-all rule, even though 42% of Kansas may vote the other way. And similarly, Connecticut has such a law that basically says the Democrats are going to get Connecticut's 7 electoral votes, regardless of what the 42% of Republicans in Connecticut think. These winner-take-all laws, which 48 of the states have, cause 2 problems. First, they elected the second-place candidate in 4 out of 56 presidential elections. And they've come close in numerous others, such as 2004, where a switch of 60,000 votes in Ohio would have elected Kerry president, even though Bush was ahead by 3 million votes. But far more important than that is that in every single presidential election, 2/3 of the states are ignored by presidential candidates. And the reason is that if you're hopelessly behind or safely ahead, as the Republican is in Kansas and the Democrat is in Connecticut, there's no reason to pay any attention to Kansas or Connecticut. We don't care about Kansas or Connecticut issues because that isn't going to get me into the White House. So presidential candidates concentrate 2/3 of their money and visits in just 6 states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, and a couple of others, and 98% of the money in just 15 states, and they leave 2/3 of the states out of the presidential race. And that affects public policy, not only when they campaign, but when they're governing 4 years and thinking ahead to re-election or the election of their successor, they fashion public policy to suit the battleground states. So the United States, as seen from the White House, is seen through the prism of the 15 or so battleground states and ignores 2/3 of the states, including Kansas. Excuse me. So those are the 2 major reasons why we think the current system is a bad one, and we have a constitutional method of changing it, namely the method the founders put in the Constitution, namely the state legislatures alone and exclusively have the power to award electoral votes. They adopted the winner-take-all system. It was only used by 3 states in 1789. It was not the founders' choice. It was never discussed in the Constitutional Convention. It was not what the founders had in mind. But in the pre-Civil War period, the vast majority of states ended up with this winner-take-all rule, which we would like to change.
Tara, can you kind of take a few moments to say why you believe the Electoral College works best, and the concerns that you have about the National Popular Vote Initiative?
Sure. I'll start with the second question, if it's okay, and then
That's
go on to
great.
the first. He said several times that basically the states have power to do this, and he's relying heavily on that. The National Popular Vote Plan is relying heavily on that. What I would say is they would have a much stronger leg to stand on if they didn't use this interstate compact that they have. Okay, now he said nobody has to allocate their electors to the winner of the national popular vote until such time as the compact is triggered, until 270 electoral votes have all agreed to do this. Okay, that looks suspiciously like an end run around the constitutional amendment process, okay? If Massachusetts or Vermont or Washington or any of these other 8 states plus the District of Columbia were to decide that this is really in their best interest, then why don't they do it now? Why doesn't Massachusetts say next year in 2012, we don't care what the other states are doing, this is in our best interest, and so we are going to allocate our winners to the winner of the national popular vote. They don't think that. They think that they want a new election system. And so that is why they are using the interstate compact method, so that they can only do it when everybody else decides to go along with them. Okay, that is what the constitutional amendment process is for, to change constitutional institutions such as the Electoral College. Now, the reason I think the Electoral College is a great system for America is because we are such a big, diverse country with so many different regions and subcultures. I was actually born in Rhode Island. I live in Texas and I claim it. and I make that point because if you tell somebody from Rhode Island that they are just like Texas, they're probably gonna be horrified, or vice versa. I mean, there are so many different interests in our country, so many different kinds of people, and to think that I mean, we are so fortunate. We are so fortunate to have such a unique presidential election process like we do that forces presidential candidates to go out and go around and talk to a variety of people from a variety of states, from a variety of regions. John mentioned several times that this election is only about the battleground states and only about the safe states are safe states and swing states are swing states, and it sounds awful. But in reality, safe states and swing states, they change all the time. And in reality, presidential candidates can't ignore the safe states, okay? The Republican Party cannot ignore the state of Texas. It might want to, but Texans do get mad eventually and decide to go do something else. California used to vote Republican, now they vote Democrat. There's a whole bunch of southern states that voted for Bill Clinton and wouldn't be caught dead voting for Barack Obama. West Virginia flipped kind of recently. Virginia's a swing state, that's kind of new. I mean, this stuff is constantly fluctuating. And so it doesn't scare me that much, let's put it that way. The specter of 8 states, quote unquote, controlling our election, that's not true. Over the course of many elections, over the course of decades and generations, we have a system that is healthy for our long-term interest as a country, that forces political parties and presidential candidates to appeal to everybody and to build national coalitions and to find that middle ground where you can bring the most people together. And this is really healthy for us.
John, I'm curious, you kind of point out that the winner-take-all piece of the electoral, the way the current system works, is really the root of the problem. If that's the case, why isn't your initiative designed to get states to, say, allocate electors by winner of congressional district, like some states already do?
Well, the congressional district system would make a bad system worse. It is true the states have the power to do that, and Nebraska and Maine currently allocate electoral votes by congressional districts, and several of the states in 1789 also use districts. However, out of 435 congressional districts, there's only 44 that are competitive, closely divided in presidential elections. So instead of 2/3 of the people being ignored, as they now are in presidential elections, basically 7 out of 8 congressional districts in the country would be ignored. You would have a presidential campaign that would be run in 45 or so battleground congressional districts. Another thing is the district system does not solve the problem that the second place candidate can win the White House. And there's plenty of data that shows that if you applied it across the country in recent elections, it would produce all sorts of distortions. Thirdly, the congressional districts are created by gerrymandering in most states, and this would further aggravate that problem. So in terms of solving the problems that we think are important, which is 2/3 of the voters, 200 million out of 300 million Americans simply do not matter in presidential elections, the district system would make it worse. In terms of solving the problem of guaranteeing that the candidate with the most votes wins the White House. The district system would make it worse, would aggravate the gerrymandering problem, and frankly, this system has almost no public support. Even in Nebraska, where we polled it, the national popular vote polls in the mid-60s. The district system polls in the high 20s.
Okay. Tara made a very interesting comment a few moments ago, and I don't think I have your words exactly, but you in essence, and I had this down as a question too, basically described this as an end run on the Constitution. Do you buy that argument?
No, I say read the Constitution. The Constitution says each state shall appoint in the manner that the legislature thereof shall direct a number of presidential electors. And that is the sole advice the founders have given the states. The Constitutional Convention considered a number of methods of electing the president: appointment by the governor, appointment by the state legislature, appointment by Congress. Some of them involved the people voting for presidents, some didn't. There were a variety of proposals on the table. But in the end, they decided that the country was best off by dispersing that power to the states, because they didn't want a monarchy recreated, and they didn't want a sitting president with a compliant Congress to be able to write the rules for presidential elections. So I tell my Republican friends, how would you have liked in 2009 if Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, when they controlled all three parts of the federal government, could have changed all the rules across the entire country to Democratic-style electoral rules with lots of early voting and same-day registration and all of that. And then I say to my Democratic friends, how would you like in 2003 if Karl Rove and George W. Bush could have rewritten with the Republican Congress 5 pieces of voter identification and limited voting hours and purging of the voting rolls every year, et cetera. So we have a very good federal system the founders set up. They gave to the states the power to control the presidency. And the states have this exclusive power, as the Supreme Court calls it. And that was done for a reason. It was not a mistake. It was not an afterthought. It was not a flaw in the Constitution. I think it's one of the wise things they did, which is state control of elections.
Please, Tara.
I think it's interesting that he just said that. He presented a really terrible specter of Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid controlling the election and vice versa, which I also would not want. But I think that is where we're going with this national popular vote plan if it's put into effect. Now, the reason I say that is because the system we have now, okay, we have 51 sets of election codes, 50 states plus the District of Columbia. Their plan in the short term does not do anything about those 50 state laws and the District of Columbia. So every single state is going to be conducting the presidential election under a different set of election codes, okay? Right now, this is fine because in Texas, I'm voting in a Texas election for Texas electors. My vote does not impact anybody in any other state and vice versa, okay? In this new system that he's talking about, all of a sudden you throw everybody into one national pot, okay? My vote in Texas, your vote in Kansas, all of a sudden we're in the same vote. It's voting pot. But we might have different laws, different early voting laws, different laws about how to get on the ballot, different laws about whether felons can vote. I can't remember if felons can vote here, I'm sorry. You know, you just have all of these different laws. What's going to happen is we're going to have chaos. Okay, you think that a couple of differences about hanging chads in Florida in 2000 was a big frickin' deal? This is worse. Now, so where we are going to go from there, whether they talk about it or not, the logical conclusion, the place that we're going to go is for a big push to figure out some way to put one set of national election codes in place. Complete, I'm sure, with a national agency, you know, the EPA, but for elections or whatever. And who's going to be in charge of that? Well, there's going to be appointments made. The president's going to appoint people to run. So I kind of think we're going where he said he doesn't want to go. And I could say a lot more about whether those laws would or would not be constitutional a federal set of election laws, but I definitely think that is where this is going. It's the logical conclusion for where we would go.
Well, it's not the logical conclusion at all. In 1969 and 79, Congress was closely considering a federal constitutional amendment to have direct popular election of the president. There's a senator from Kansas, Bob Dole, who was one of the major sponsors and spokesmen for that. And that constitutional amendment did not take away state control of election. It retained the different voting hours in Texas versus Kansas and the other slight differences, and there are numerous differences between the state election code. The constitutional amendment simply said, we're going to give the presidency to the candidate who gets the most popular votes in the country as a whole. And we're going to continue to rely on the state legislatures and governors who adopt their own state election laws to do the election in their own state, and we will add up the numbers. Now, there's no chaos there. There's no confusion. This was the mainstream view, passed the House by a 5-to-1 margin. George Herbert Walker Bush voted for it. President Nixon endorsed it. President Ford endorsed it. Carter endorsed it. Mondale endorsed it. Dole endorsed it. There's nothing incompatible about retaining state control of elections and having an adding up of the votes from all 50 states. That's what the mainstream view was then. That's what I think the mainstream view in the country still is. We have a federalist system. We like it. It works well. It protects us against one party getting the upper hand, which is perhaps its most important feature. But we have a federal system. And there aren't going to be any presidentially appointed commissions under our bill. You can read our bill. There are no death panels in our bill. There are none of these other things. This bill simply says the candidate who gets the most popular votes in all 50 states is going to end up with enough electoral votes to give him the keys to the White House.
Sounds to me like a lot of people endorsed an extraordinarily bad idea, and a lot of people had never seen the 2000 election, okay? If they had ever seen how much fuss could be made out of a couple of stinking hanging chads, what do you think they would do with the... You guys have to understand how many laws there are in all the different states, and now suddenly you're going to throw all of these into a decision about how we're going to resolve our presidential election. You guys can see these lawsuits. We live in a very litigious society, and you can see these lawsuits as quickly as I can. But I didn't get enough time to vote, as much time as the person in Oklahoma. I didn't, I didn't have a ballot that was as clear. I didn't know who to vote for. Thinking about the butterfly ballots in Florida. I just didn't know, and they did. That's not fair. Guys can see this. Okay? And if nothing else, it'll just be a series of lawsuits every year that we have to deal with because some poor person thinks they were not treated fairly. Okay, right now, we have a system where there is not this discrepancy, or to the degree we do have a discrepancy, I guess it's relatively minor, like the one in Florida in 2000 among counties about how to count a hanging chad. Okay? I do not think I can state often enough how much problem this could create if we had these numerous laws trying to control one election. Guys, the most basic rule of democracy, the most basic rule, is that everybody lives under the same set of laws. And certainly at election time, that has to be one of the things we are most worried about, that we all vote under the same set of election laws.
Well, let's say when the Constitution was ratified, there were only 2 states that directly elected the governor. Let's say we were still back then, and we were proposing to elect the governor of Kansas by a popular vote instead of, say, counting up how many counties each candidate for governor got support in. Does anybody seriously think that there's a problem mechanical problem that would have prevented the adoption of direct election of governors? Let's look at the facts. She talks about Florida recount. The current system has a terrible performance record. There have been 5 litigated cases of presidential election counts in a mere 56 presidential elections. 5 out of 56. In ordinary elections, such as the governor of Kansas or the governor of New York, the chance of a recount or dispute is about 1 in 160, and that's based on a study of thousands of elections over a 25-year period. The chance of a disputed election when there's a single pool of votes and a candidate with the most votes wins is very, very small. When was the last time there was a statewide recount in Kansas? We can't find from the state historian in California that there's ever been a statewide recount in California, for example. I don't know how often it happens in Kansas. The fact is it's very, very rare. The reason we've had 5 litigated, disputed presidential counts in 56 presidential elections is because every single presidential election is 51 separate elections, and there's 51 separate occasions for this super close result. There was nothing close about the result in 1888 when Grover Cleveland was leading by 3.5%. By the way, the same margin Bush won in 2004, a nice substantial margin. But he was behind in the Electoral College. In 1876, the same thing. In 2000, there was nothing close about the national popular vote. It was 540,000 votes difference between the two candidates. What was close is in one particular state, there was a 537 vote difference, and that's what caused the dispute. Under national popular vote, nobody would have cared who won or didn't win a mere plurality in Florida. The question would have been, who won by 500,000 votes? Far more than's ever changed in the recount, which, by the way, on a 25-year average, the average change in a count is 296 votes in a statewide election. So recounts change very little. They rarely change the outcome. And the most important point is they are very rare when you run elections the way every other election is run in the United States, namely the candidate with the most votes in the entire jurisdiction wins the office.
John, you mentioned the effort in the 69 and 70 to amend the Constitution and change the way the president's elected. Why did you choose not to go through the constitutional amendment? Isn't that a good way to raise the visibility of the issue, to get the public engaged in an open debate on whether or not that's something that should be done at the national level?
Well, the public is engaged, and we're pursuing this in the way the Constitution provided. The Constitution says the states have the exclusive power. Sure, you could go for a constitutional amendment. I suppose you could have adopted the Bush tax cuts by a constitutional amendment. But the reality is that Congress had the power to adopt a change in taxation, and the states, in the words of the Supreme Court, have exclusive and plenary power to award electoral votes. So the proper way to do this is the way that's in the Constitution, not to disrespect the Constitution by trying to change it.
He's got the wrong analogy. This isn't about the Bush tax cuts. This is about the amendment that we passed to say you could have an income tax in this country. Okay, it's the same thing. We're talking about fundamentally changing the way that we elect presidents. This is not about some state exercising its discretion. Again, if they would have much stronger argument if they were not relying upon an interstate compact. Okay, the interstate compact is taking the place of what the constitutional amendment process, that ratification process, should be.
Well, it's not, but
how come? They all agree. They all, either you have a constitutional amendment process where you have 38 states that come together and agree, or you have an interstate compact where as few as 11 states could decide to do this to the rest of the country.
Well, as few as 11 states can elect the president now, and they never do. We're talking
that would
about
be 1 year. This is something that would endure over time, or that would be hard to undo.
Tara, you talk about the current system as if it was in the Constitution and the founders wanted it. The winner-take-all rules, which is what we're trying to change, state laws, they were not passed by constitutional amendment, okay? They were passed in about 5 decades after the Constitution by states. Now, if it was improper to have the states today execute the National Popular Vote bill and install a national popular vote, then it was equally improper for your current winner-take-all law to have been adopted, because that was a fundamental change from what the founders wanted. The founders wanted a deliberative electoral college where the most respected and high-minded citizens, a small select number, would get together and judiciously choose the president. That's what they wanted. They didn't get it because the political parties formed and basically said, we don't care about this picking the best person to be president. We want to campaign against the other party and take the White House for our party. But the fact is the winner-take-all rule was not adopted by constitutional amendment, and therefore it doesn't take a constitutional amendment to repeal it.
Not to beat a dead horse, but if Massachusetts believes that it's in Massachusetts' best interest, they should just pass that law. They don't need a compact. The problem is the compact, which is enabling states to work together. They're not out there doing it by themselves because they think this is in the best interest of their state. They want to change the institution in this country. You want to change. You want a national popular vote in this country. You don't want a federalist process.
We do want a federalist process. We want to retain the Electoral College and state control of elections. But the fact is that the interstate compact, which is what this is a specific power that the states have under the Constitution. The states may join with other states to exercise any power that rightfully belongs to the state in a joint manner through the mechanism of an interstate compact, which makes it enforceable. There are lots of interstate compacts.
The Constitution also says Congress should approve an interstate compact.
Well, the approval process we can discuss as a separate question, but the fact is the Constitution gives the states the power to exercise legitimate state powers in conjunction with a neighboring state, another state. That's a constitutional power. It's legally enforceable. There are lots of interstate compacts, hundreds of them.
It's a slippery slope is the problem. What can we not do by interstate compact if we can do this?
You can do anything by interstate compact.
It's a state power.
That is a state power. And in my copy of the Constitution, it says the power delegated to the United States by the Constitution and not prohibited to the states by the Constitution are reserved to the states. So we have two state powers here, an explicit state power to award electoral votes, an explicit state power to enter into agreements with other states, and we have, I think it's called the 10th Amendment, the fact that if there's no restriction on the state power in the federal Constitution, the states have the right to do it. And frankly, the problem, Tara, is you just don't like what the states are going to do using the Constitution that the founders gave us. You have a policy difference, and you're trying to convert it into a legalistic theory.
I noticed that you never reference Article 5. You can spit off a bunch of constitutional provisions, and you never ever mention Article 5, which of course is the constitutional amendment process. I do have a policy difference with him. If Texas were to be discussing whether to ratify a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College, I would fight against it tooth and nail. But if the country were to decide, if 38 states were to come together and decide that this is what we want to do, I would respect that decision, I would respect it as law. I would respect that it's something that's been done. It doesn't mean I'd agree with it. It doesn't mean I wouldn't be trying hard to repeal it. But there is a really big difference between that process of everybody coming together, learning about our Electoral College, learning about our presidential election system, and then deciding they don't want it anymore, and then what they're doing, which is, with all due respect, not nearly as well publicized, people don't really know what's going on, by and large. Political junkies, like maybe many people in this room, might know about it, especially more, I think, since California decided to pass this earlier this year. But most Americans have no idea what's going on, and I don't think this is a good, healthy process for our country to change our presidential election system this radically with so little debate.
Well, the founders gave it to the states. You just don't like the decision the founders made, and the state legislatures, of which there's 7,400 of them, have been given this power by the founders in the Constitution explicitly, and we think there's plenty of public debate. There have been over 400 public hearings. This bill has passed 31 chambers in 21 states. It's got 1 million+ hits on Google if you Google National Popular Vote. We are here tonight discussing it, as I've been at numerous other meetings and, in fact, debates with Tara and other people, and she's been in numerous states where I haven't been debating this. This is a national issue, but we're doing it the way the Constitution set up. You just don't like what's in the Constitution.
I just keep remembering Article 5. It gets in the way.
I want to try an experiment here. Everybody just bear with me a second and let's see if this yields anything interesting. Now, I'm not asking you about popular vote versus the Electoral College, but I'm asking you before you heard about tonight's program, how many of you are aware of the National Popular Vote initiative that we're talking about tonight? How many were aware of that specific initiative? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those guys have a dog in the hunt. They don't count. 7, 8. So 8 of you had heard. What does that say to the 2 of you about this process?
It makes my point.
Now, let's ask the audience another question. How many of you knew that the winner-take-all rule and the method of electing the president is not in the U.S. Constitution at all? It was strictly a matter of state law. How many of you knew that before you walked in?
A few more,
a few
but
more,
a lot don't know.
But most didn't. So we've all learned something about what's actually in the Constitution. I learned it in the 60s. To my bitter regret, I got into a huge argument in the dorm with a pre-law student, and I was sure the U.S. Constitution said something about Michigan's electoral votes, or every state's electoral votes going to the candidate who carried the state. And lo and behold, the Constitution didn't say that.
I think the one thing the 2 of you probably could agree on tonight is everybody should go home and read the Constitution and see
Absolutely.
exactly what's in it, because we all could learn something, so I may do that too. We're going to open up to your Q&A in just a few moments here, but bear with me. I want to ask a couple more quick questions. What is this proposal going to do to the two-party system?
Well, the two-party system will operate very nicely. We've had elections of governors, chief executives, 5,000 of them since 1789, and the two-party system in which the candidate who gets the most votes for governor in the state becomes governor, has not killed the two-party system.
John knows that I disagree. There's actually a whole chapter in my book, which you guys are welcome to read, about how this is going to undermine the two-party system. Look, the winner-take-all rule that he has been bashing, actually it does something nice for us, which is that it has given us a strong two-party system in this country. It makes it difficult to succeed as a third-party candidate. Now that has pros and cons, okay? I will be the first to stand up here and say there are pluses and minuses to the situation. I like a good third-party candidate as much as anybody sometimes. But the problem with the system where you can have too many third-party candidates too easily is you don't only enable kind of the rational ones that have lots of support, think Ross Perot 1992, you also enable the more radical ones, and you give them a better opportunity to get a good foothold in our country. Think George Wallace, who John was complaining about earlier. I mean, it's not perfect. I've never said the Electoral College is perfect. It is the best alternative available to us, and I think a part of that actually is the winner-take-all system and the fact that it supports our two-party system, and NPV would undermine that.
Well, I just can't let this George Wallace thing go by. If you look at the last 16 presidential elections, there have been 6 cases out of 16 where the current winner-take-all method, state by state, of awarding electoral votes has encouraged and resulted in third-party candidates affecting and determining the outcome of the presidential election. George Wallace being one of them. Certainly Ralph Nader was in 2000, and we have Strom Thurmond in 1948, and so forth. So John Anderson in 1980. So the current system, the current state-by-state winner-take-all system, produces far more third-party candidates than any election for governor does. And the reason is that a George Wallace can actually win electoral votes in certain states by concentrating, say, on a southern constituency, or Strom Thurmond can do that. Or a Ralph Nader can flip Florida, or by the way, he flipped Missouri in 2008. Most people don't know that, and Bob Barr flipped North Carolina in 2008. The fact is, the current system undermines the two-party system simply because it gives fringe candidates the opportunity shop around for a few states where they can perversely affect the national outcome. You don't see that in any other race for governor. 90% of the governor's races since World War II, the winner has had over 50%. 99% the winners had over 40%. 100% of the races, the winners had over 35%. So this notion that Tara likes to talk about of 15% candidates winning an office simply does not match reality.
I would present all of that a little bit differently. I may not disagree quite as much as you think I do. I agree third-party candidates do have an impact on our elections sometimes. I think that's good because the thing is, in our system, if you are a reasonable, rational third-party candidate, I kind of want those guys to hold the two major parties in line, to keep them honest. I think it's fabulous that Ross Perot had as much of an impact as he did. Okay, in the next election, Ross Perot got 18.9% of the vote. He got 0 electors, but he definitely impacted that election. That was great. And you know what? Both parties had to come back next time and address his fiscal concerns. That was great. I want healthy third parties in this country to impact the national debate. But I don't want the extremist guys to have an opportunity to get too much of a foothold. Okay? George Wallace, who he was referencing a second ago, like their thought was that they would force a House contingent election. That was how they were trying to impact the election. He failed miserably. Okay, 1912, Teddy Roosevelt did not get this was after he was president, came back, didn't like Taft, he wanted to overthrow Taft. He couldn't get it done, okay? There's just an interesting dynamic here. Third parties have some power, but not too much power. And I think that is great. At the end of the day, though, the fact that the two-party system is there and is kind of the basis of our politics, it's healthy for our country because it forces us to come together, to work together, to understand each other, to find a good middle ground, you know, where you can get as many people as possible to vote for your party.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to your questions and answers. This is my kind of program. I don't have to ask questions. I'll just toss something out and it just goes back and forth like a tennis match, so I get to kind of sit over here and watch and have fun. By the way, we do have copies, quite a few copies of John's book. We have a substantial number of Tara's books tonight. If you want to pick those books up, they're free. They provide them at no charge to you. They're out front, and I bet they'll both be willing to sign some of them too. So this is a rare opportunity to get a very interesting pair of books at no charge, and most of you could probably walk out of here with both of those tonight. But let's open it up to Q&A. Raise your hand if you have a question. Wait for one of our students to come by, and do stick to a question, no statements. Kristen?
Yes, I thought the third question you might have asked the audience is how interested are we in the national popular vote? And if we think that our vote would count more if we only had that as our assurance that when we made that connection with that candidate, that it would count, that some of the representative would not have gone into that electoral college and decided because my state did not agree with me. I've lived in 4 different states, and it's always against my grain because it's never the candidate that I vote for because my state went the other party. So I always feel as though my vote never counts. And so I just want to know, would more people feel their vote counted if they didn't have the state in which they live always go against their vote?
So in other words, do people think that the National Popular Vote Initiative, as proposed, would be a better way to pick presidents?
A better way for us to all want to vote.
To encourage you to vote because you know that the ultimate winner of the popular vote is going to win. How many people agree with that? Raise your hand. How many people disagree with that? Raise your hand. Okay, so definitely for that particular side. Quinn?
I was kind of, is it gone? Okay. I thought one of the first points would be made is, I think I remember from way back when I went to school back in the, was it the 18th century, I believe, was that we really wouldn't have much effect here in these small population states because just a few large states would really control the whole election.
Very good question. That was on my list.
Well, I would certainly like to call your attention to the two charts, particularly the one about the 25 states, which lists the 25 smallest states, of which Kansas is right near the median, about the 22nd smallest state. And you'll notice that the presidential candidates simply don't campaign in 18 of the 25 smallest states. Why? Not because you're small. They spent 12 of their 300 visits post-convention in Nevada. They spent 12 in New Hampshire. They spent 8 in New Mexico. All of those states are smaller than Kansas. They spent 0 in Kansas and the other 17 states. Why? Not because Kansas is that small, because you're bigger than all 3 of those states, but because Kansas is a one-party state. Same reason they didn't campaign in Vermont or Hawaii or Delaware. Those are also one-party states. So if you want to read about the myth of the small states being advantaged by the current system, look at the chart and then flip the page over for the quote from Bob Dole, where he, by the way, helped us name the book. And in boldface, I won't read the quote and take time, but the quote from Bob Dole about how basically the only way small states can get a voice in the presidential election is through a direct popular vote of the president, in which the candidate who gets the most votes wins.
Look, if you're a candidate for president and your goal is to get the most individual votes, what are you going to do? Are you going to go out to some sparsely populated small state? Are you going to go out to Wyoming? Are you going to go hang out in the middle of a bunch of farms where you can talk to maybe 5 people at a time or something? No, you're going to go to the big urban areas where the most people are. You're going to get the most bang for your buck there. And that's just logical strategy. So this all sounds very nice and pretty, and it makes a good soundbite, and the soundbites about the swing states can sound very scary. But look, in real life, what we have here is a situation where presidential candidates, what they're striving for is the most states' votes, the most electoral votes. And so they are rewarded when they spread out their attention to as many people as possible. And maybe if you pick a particular election year, as many people across as many states as possible. Maybe we have a situation where in a particular election year, you know, why go to Texas, why to go to California? We know how that's going to turn out. But over the course of many elections, many decades, over the course of generations, you force political parties and presidential candidates to spread out their attention and to pay attention to everybody, because there is no other way to win consistently in our election system.
Well, there's been no presidential candidate who has seriously campaigned in Kansas in the lifetime of anybody in the room, including the fellow who claims to be from the 18th century. The reality is that the only way to make a vote count where a vote in Kansas is suddenly as important as a vote in Nevada and New Mexico is to have every vote in the United States matter in every election in every state. And that's what a national popular vote bill does. And before we get into this big cities, boo, taking control of the world, keep in mind that Kansas is not so small. Kansas, Utah, Oklahoma, and Nebraska have less than a third the population of California. They produced a bigger margin for George W. Bush than California produced for Kerry. So this notion that the big states are going to vote 100% Democratic, and this notion that the big states are all Democratic, which of course 5 of the 11 are mostly Republican most of the time, is just nonsense. The reality is, under national popular vote, your vote will suddenly be as important as a vote in a battleground state. It is not important now. It's of no importance now. Tara's vote is not important for president now. She lives in Texas. My vote is not important. I live in California. Your vote is of no importance now because you live in Kansas.
Look, by and large, Kansas must be a lot more happy with the Republican Party than with the Democratic Party. And that's why it turns out that way. And if they decide that they want to be discontent and express it, then they can do that, and they can flip things on a dime pretty fast. And again, I go back to some of my other examples. Texas used to be Democrat, okay? It's painted now like this big red state. And by the way, I lived there, and people are not altogether happy with the Republican Party in Texas, and I see it changing, okay? The Speaker of the House of Representatives was elected in Texas, was elected mostly by Democrats. I mean, it's kind of changing. Democrats in the House. It's changing, and these things are not nearly as set in stone as they like to present it. And any state that is discontent can make themselves heard pretty darn fast.
Okay, Kristen?
Hi there. Thank you for coming. I always come to the Dole Institute and hearing the latest thing. But one of the, I guess the things that concerns me is a little bit of the large states wood control. But I think that the compact is a really bad idea. And I think it's really a Democratic plan really to take over the elections. But I guess my question to you guys is one of your premises, Doctor, that you've pushed forward, is that these candidates would go and visit these small states or these small areas. But what I think the question is, with the internet campaigning, will the visits of candidates become irrelevant because of the technology that we have today to be able to reach people with the internet and so forth and so on?
Well, campaigning will change, but right now, the internet is a small part of the pie, but over time, technology changes. I mean, radio was once dominant, then TV is now, at least in political campaigns. It may well be the internet in 20 years.
John, is this a Democratic initiative?
No, our proposal was bipartisan from the beginning. Our advisory board is bipartisan. We have 2,100 sponsors. We initially got much more support from Democrats than Republicans, largely, I think, because we were closer to 2000 when we started our project in 2005, and the memory of the 2000 election has diminished. A majority of the Republican House caucus in South Carolina are sponsors of our bill. Republican House caucus. The Republican-controlled New York Senate passed our bill. The Republican Speaker of Missouri and Minnesota are sponsors. Former Minnesota Representative Laura Broad, who's here tonight with me, was a sponsor of the bill, and she was the former ALEC chair in Minnesota.
Tell everybody what ALEC is. That's a political acronym. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Yes, it's a conservative group, very federalist-oriented. So you can tell if this is bipartisan very simply. Look at the presidential election counts for the last 30 years. The country is almost equally divided. The national popular vote doesn't always go to Democrats. Where did we get Reagan and Bush in 2004 from? Sometimes it goes to the Democrats. It's certainly not permanent. We're going to have a close election next time, as far as anybody can tell. There's nothing permanently built in for either party.
Okay, question over here.
There's a movement afoot attributed to the Republicans trying to game this next presidential election by changing from state take all to a district, as you mentioned, Bill, in your question. What would prevent in the future, if the state compact, I can't envision what it would be, but gamesmanship with the legislature of the proposal that you're making?
Well, what he's referring to is the bills in Pennsylvania and Minnesota and possibly a couple other states where Republican-controlled state government happens to be in power in states that normally vote for Democrats, like Pennsylvania. That's constitutional. The states have the power to allocate electoral votes in any manner they see fit, and they certainly have that power to do so by district. What would keep it from gaming in the future is public opinion. Basically, when we polled Oklahoma, and I'm sorry we don't have a poll in Kansas, 81% support a national popular vote. It's another spectator state. It's 80% in Kentucky. It's 73, I think, in Nebraska. What holds this together is public opinion. The public thinks that their vote should count and that the candidate with the most votes should win, and ultimately that gets reflected in state legislatures. But there's no guarantee that Pennsylvania won't adopt the district system. In fact, as I understand it, that bill is still live in Pennsylvania and may very well pass.
Kristen?
I have a question. We all understand that democracy was never ever mentioned in any of our founding documents. You know, we're a constitutional republic, and there's good reason for that too, because of the fear of the mob rule effect. So, does the National Popular Vote Initiative protect against the minority interest for either of you?
I'm not sure I know what you mean. It protects against the minority interest?
Interest of, say, for instance, 49% of the people being led by 51% of the people.
I think the Electoral College does that.
Well, that's what.
Right.
Yeah, that's my point. So,
right.
So I just wanted to hear your opinion on that.
I agree with you. This is a republic. It's a constitution that combines Republican small r principles with Democratic small d principles with Federalist principles. And the reason this was done was for our protection. You're absolutely right. We don't want to live in a country where 51% can do anything in the world to the other 49%. That's not healthy for us. The founders saw that. They wanted to avoid that. I'm sure John and Laura have heard me multiple times give the example. Look, in the wake of something like 9/11, in fear or anger or outrage, bigotry, whatever, 51% could do anything to the other 49%, punish them for their religion or whatever. That's not the kind of country we live in. And that's not what the founders wanted. And so the founders wanted a self-governing nation, and so they did put democratic principles in there, but they tempered the democratic principles with these other protections. And I would suggest the Electoral College is one of them. For some of the reasons I've been saying. It forces presidential candidates to go out and to make sure, first of all, to make sure they have the support of a reasonable majority, not a bare majority that is maybe acting in emotion or on a whim. This is the same reason we have a Senate with one state, one vote representation, as opposed to the House with one person, one vote, or the presidential veto, or any of these other protections in our Constitution. The Electoral College is just one of these things that to make sure that we can be a self-governing nation that succeeds, that does not implode like some of the democracies that the founders had studied.
Well, I certainly agree we're a constitutional republic and minorities deserve protection, but I guess I don't agree with your mob rule comment. The Electoral College does nothing in this regard. The mob in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida determines who gets in the White House, whether it's by 50.1% to 49.9%. So it's not a question of whether the mob rules. The mob does rule. It's the mob in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, maybe Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, and New Hampshire that control the outcome. But there's no protection in that the mob in those 7 states are any wiser or more judicious or more fair or more sensitive to minorities than if the whole country had voted.
Okay, Quinn?
Well, I must say I am a little disappointed to hear your rather dim view of congressional districting. My thoughts are drawn to the state of Nebraska in the 2008 election, in which I don't know the number of the district, but the Omaha district voted Democrat in a state that traditionally votes Republican. And as a member of Douglas County, a more liberal area of Kansas, I feel a connection to those members of that Omaha district. And I wonder, perhaps if you were to subtract the 2 Senate votes, or the 2 electoral votes reflecting the 2 Senate votes that each state receives, how is this not a healthy compromise between the standard winner-take-all system and a popular vote?
Well, you can look at Nebraska and see what's wrong with the district system. First of all, the 2nd district, which has Omaha, which is the closely divided district that Obama carried by 3,000 votes, and he won 1 electoral vote from Nebraska, is only one of 3 districts in Nebraska. There was no presidential campaign in the other 2 congressional districts, one of which McCain carried by 50,000 votes and the other by 25 or so thousand votes. So you can see that the district system did not make every voter in Nebraska relevant. It made selected voters in the one battleground congressional district of Nebraska relevant. It created an inequality of vote. Obama got 1 electoral vote for his 3,000 vote margin. McCain got 1 electoral vote for his 50,000 vote margin. So it created a big inequality in the state. And as I said before, there's only a small percentage, about 1 in 8 congressional districts that are competitive in presidential elections. So we go from a system now where the election is in 1/3 of the states to an election where the presidency would be decided by roughly 1/8 of the congressional districts of the country. And we wouldn't have a guarantee against second place winners. I don't know what more I can say about the district system other than I really don't like it.
Okay, we have time for one more question from this side, one more question from this side.
So thinking of the 2008 election, if we had the national popular vote, I think that maybe Hillary Clinton wouldn't have bowed out, maybe Mitt Romney wouldn't have bowed out. So I could see that you would have 4 strong candidates and someone gets maybe 26%. Does that concern you, that they would win the election?
Well, I think the hypothetical is wrong because the existing system, which governs every other election in the United States, the candidate with the most votes wins, is basically what creates the 2-party system. It forces the Hillary Clinton and the Obama not to run as separate campaigns for the same office, but to accept one or the other as a nominee and run. That's why in 5,000 governor's elections that this country has run, we don't see candidates winning with 26% or 15%. We see 99% of them winning with more than 40%. So it's just not true that Romney and McCain and Obama and Clinton would all have run for president. They would have coalesced. And this is basically a law of political science that's been observed in country after country. I think it's called Duvaine's law. And it basically says that a plurality voting system creates a 2-party system.
That's what political science theory says. There are also a history of exceptions to that rule. And there are exceptions in our own country. I mean, why did Meeks, what's his name, Meeks, not buy out of Florida in the governor's race? Everybody was telling him to. He probably gave the election to Rubio because Christ and Meeks could not combine their votes. I happen to agree with you. If the national popular vote were in place, then probably what would happen is candidates like Romney and Clinton would have no reason to get out. Why would they get out? And if they did get out, why would they get out so early? They would get out maybe later in the process is the best you could hope for. But I mean, this goes back to why I think there is a real danger that the 2-party system would be undermined. Maybe it would not happen right away. I think we are very used to thinking in terms of a 2-party system psychologically, and just, that's what we do. But I think over time, the first time you have a Ross Perot that wins 18.9% of the vote or whatever it is, people are motivated by that. And it'll make them more likely to go out and support third-party candidates in the future.
Very quickly, look at the history of 5,000 governor's elections. We have data here. We don't have to speculate about this novel idea that the candidate who gets the most votes ought to win the office.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Quinn?
Curious, do you feel that the presidential campaigns actually prefer the electoral college system now because it's easier for them to focus their campaigns on 5 or 6 swing states as opposed to actually having to, focus on garnering popular votes across the entire nation, doing national campaigns, and this way they can just focus their efforts on, a handful of states?
Oh, you bet. The existing political consultants, they make their living out of their expertise on how to carry Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida. They hate this, bipartisanly.
Counter-argument, with the national popular vote in place, it might be easier for them because they could just go hang out in a bunch of urban areas, maybe get help from Acorn or whoever is the political machine in that area that's going to help them win that area. And it might actually be easier for them that way.
Well, you know, we know that's not true. When Sebelius won the governorship here in Kansas, did she only campaign in the 3rd Congressional District and hang out in Overland and Kansas City and ignore the other 3 congressional districts? When your Republican wins the statewide office, do they only campaign in the western half of the state, the 1st district? That's ludicrous. We have examples by the 100 year after year in governors and Senate elections when every vote is equal, the candidates campaign throughout the entire jurisdiction. There is nothing special about a vote in Overland versus a vote in the southwest corner of Kansas.
Kansas is way smaller than the United States of America. The United States of America is a big, huge place. What would be a better, not even a good example, but a slightly better example is Texas, where yeah, it actually does matter. I mean, the people in Dallas or Austin or San Antonio or Houston do get a little bit more attention. So I think it definitely matters.
I want to thank our guests for joining us tonight for this discussion.